Hey everyone, and welcome to Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva. Today we're speaking with Leo Schwartz. Leo is a rest of world reporter based in Brooklyn. He graduated from New York University with a dual master's in journalism and Latin American studies, and was the web editor at the NACLA Report, which is a quarterly magazine and online publication on Latin America. His work has appeared in Columbia Journalism Review, The Nation, PBS NewsHour, and Roads and Kingdoms. It's quite the resume. Leo, thanks for taking time to be here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor.
Terrific. So let's jump right in and talk about Rest of World. What is Rest of World?
So, Rest of World is an international publication that focuses on technology news outside of the Western bubble. We were founded last year, actually, so we just hit our 1 year mark, which is very exciting.
Congrats.
We have a team of about 25. Thank you. Yeah, we have a team of about 25 reporters, editors, and product team based all around the world. And we have a really exciting mandate, which is, again, to cover the types of tech stories that are often overlooked by Western media, and also try to escape the Western gaze that you have too often when you look at tech stories outside of places like the United States and Western Europe. So, really trying to center voices in different regions and talk about those connections between different companies or the impact of technology that often doesn't get covered. And in this position, I mostly focus on Latin America, but again, we have team members in Africa and South Asia, uh, and all across the United States too,
Cool.
and of course in Latin America.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to add that to my regular reading. I've heard it referenced a few times on, pardon me, on Daily Tech News Show. When they find interesting tech stories that are written about in rest of world. But yeah, I'm gonna want to have to check it out more often. So, what led you to join that team at Rest of World?
So I've always been fascinated with journalism and considered it a dream career, getting to look into stories that you find interesting, talk to really fascinating people, and get to ask them any questions you want, and then package those stories into ways that can get across in accessible ways to readers. At Rest of World, it's really amazing because I think I get to work on a lot of stories that aren't getting covered, especially in English, but often not at all. So it's a lot of opportunities to look at the type of stories that again don't really get covered, and are bringing a fresh take to the omnipresent story of technology and its impact around the world. I joined Rest of World about a year and 3 months ago as a tech fellow. They had a really cool fellowship where they brought on some recent grads from all across the world. Again, I came on mostly to cover Latin America, and then I've stayed on the publication since then. And I'll be moving, uh, knocking on wood, to Mexico in September to be doing my post from there. So hopefully we'll be able to do more on the ground reporting than obviously has been possible over the past year with COVID.
Yeah, I can imagine so. I can't imagine the difficulty you have trying to write about something happening in Mexico or Costa Rica or something like that. Meanwhile, you're in Brooklyn, and like, are you just trying to cultivate sources like any other journalist would?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a lot of spending time on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on different social networks, and reading the news and trying to find people who would be good to talk to and finding stories that might be interesting to cover. I think it's been sort of a double edged sword. Obviously, as a journalist, it's much better to be on the ground and actually talking to people in person and finding stories in person. But with this broad mandate that we have, and especially for me in covering an entire region, it's also made me appreciative of a lot of the technology that exists, like Zoom, where I can talk to people across different time zones and different parts of the world from anywhere.
Hmm.
And I think it allows us to cover stories that probably wouldn't have been possible 5 or 10 years ago, because we do have access through these different platforms. Again, though, it'll be nice to be in Mexico and actually get to do on the ground reporting for the first time.
Yeah, no, of course. We'll get back to that the tech side of things and having access to that in a little bit. But want to backtrack a little bit here and ask about why get into journalism? Why what interests you about journalism and especially your focus on tech, politics, and food?
Yeah, so I would say when I was in undergrad, I mostly focused on journalism and digital rights from a civil rights perspective and the ability of people to both be able to access news and the threats facing journalists across the world. And then after college, I just realized that I wanted to work on this from a two-pronged approach, both being able to cover those types of stories of the freedom of press and how digital media is changing the nature of journalism, and get to report as a journalist, which, as I said before, I think is one of the best jobs you could possibly have. Obviously, it's a fairly tenuous time for journalism, both from increasingly authoritarian threats from governments around the world, as well as the threats posed by digital media and advertising. But I also think that as someone working in journalism, that makes it an exciting time to be able to figure out new ways to be able to connect with readers, to be able to tell stories. I think examples like Rest of World, which is a newly launched publication, represents the future of journalism, where we are trying to come up with innovative ways, not just in the types of stories that we tell, but the ways that we tell them. Um, from a technology perspective, when I graduated from college, sort of as a rudderless 21-year-old who vaguely wanted to get into journalism but didn't really know how to do that, I actually worked in tech in Silicon Valley for a few years at a startup that was building PR technology. So basically, the idea was figuring out a way to make press coverage more accessible for smaller startups and nonprofits who obviously can't afford 30K a month retainers from PR firms. And as part of that job, I was basically just interviewing dozens and dozens of founders every week to help them essentially figure out their media strategies. And that was really my first dive into technology. I think, as is tradition of technology, some of the founders were perhaps a little more on the delusional end, some certainly more noble and acting in good faith in what they were trying to do. But I think it was a really good exposure in a number of different fields across technology, and understanding everything from health tech to ed tech. And I was also there in 2017 at the height of the ICO, international initial coin offering and crypto craze. So that was certainly eye opening and has, I think, affected a lot of the ways that I approach technology as a reporter. And then lastly, combining those two things, journalism and technology. I talk a lot about this with other tech reporters, but I think that we're just getting to a point where tech permeates every aspect of our lives, from politics to business to culture. And it's a really privileged position to get to be a tech reporter and look at the ways that it's impacting our lives in all these different ways. And it really is, I think, completely unbiased. As a tech reporter, the predominant story happening in the world right now.
Yeah, you mentioned politics there. We're about to head into a federal election here in Canada. It was just called on Sunday, and because our election cycles are way shorter than yours in the states, our election day is actually September 20th. So it's 5 weeks, and all the stories
Sounds nice.
recently in the Toronto Star and other publications are all about are talking about how the Liberal Party thinks they're going to win, how they want to get a majority, and the Conservative Party and what they're doing. And a lot of it is around all the new tech and all the new data that they've been able to collect over the past few years, and how they use sophisticated tech from sometimes overseas, or the liberals are borrowing heavily from the Biden campaign, um, and how they're putting that to use to help get the vote out and find appropriate voters and all that. And obviously, Facebook has I just went through this process yesterday. If you want to put together a political ad, now you have a whole bunch of extra stuff you need to jump through, hoops to jump through in order to engage in that way on that platform. So yeah, it's definitely how you play the game right now. I guess is the ground game still matters, but who you target with the ground game is really what matters, and collecting that data and harnessing it and analyzing it and then putting it to use is where that tech comes in. So it's, yeah, things have definitely changed um since 2012. I think Obama really kicked that off, I think, back in 2008, but it's gotten even more and more sophisticated since then. um you mentioned a lot of things there that have come up in journalism, and how much tougher it is for a publication to make money. Essentially, I think we've seen that a lot over the past decade or so. um, has that been probably the toughest challenge you faced in the field, whether it was at rest of world or elsewhere, or has something else been even tougher to handle?
I think there's a lot of precarity for journalists and certainly for outlets in terms of funding models. I think there's a lot of novel new ways emerging to create more sustainable types of publications and ones that have more direct connections to their readers, such as different nonprofit and community driven models. We're really lucky at Rest of World that we're a nonprofit, which I think really helps in having freedom to be able to tell the stories that we want to tell in the way that we want to tell them. But certainly, I see a lot of my colleagues in the field and other journalists and outlets facing that precarity, and it is a really difficult position to be in as a reporter, and especially reporters outside of the United States, where salaries tend to be much lower. It's a real issue in Latin America, where I am lucky to work with a lot of co-reporters on the ground there, which has been one of our strategies for dealing with the difficulties of COVID over the past year, which is to do a lot of co-reported stories and something that we hope
Yeah.
to continue doing in the future. But obviously, for journalists in Latin America, again, they're facing not just the threats of governments and non-state actors and a lot of violence that's happening through that, but also the economic precarity that comes with being a journalist, where you're really often not making enough money to survive, especially given the threats that are happening. Uh, so yeah, I think I've been in a very privileged position, especially with this position at Rest of World, to not have to face that in too acute a manner. But I do think that that is a major threat and challenge facing any journalist working right now.
Fair enough. What are some of the stories you're working on right now that you can tell us about?
I just had a story come out last week that I'm really excited about that is based off this new report from Access Now, which is a fantastic global digital rights organization.
Yeah.
And it was looking at the proliferation of surveillance technology across Latin America. And most of that surveillance tech is coming from foreign firms, a lot of them in China, a lot in Israel. And one interesting aspect that I honed in on in this article was that in a lot of cases, and especially in Brazil, these surveillance firms are giving their technology for free to both national and local governments, which is a pretty fascinating development. So we were trying to answer the question of why that's happening and how that's impacting surveillance on the ground in those countries. And that's a topic that I'd really love to explore more. And I think is really indicative of what we're trying to do as publication, which is to look at these transnational links between countries that don't involve the United States. So in this case, you're looking at the connection between, for example, Brazil and companies like Huawei in China,
Hmm.
uh, and how those relationships are formed, what the economic pathways are for doing that, what the motivations are for both parties, and then, of course, how that's affecting people on the ground there. I think an interesting question to come out of that I hope to explore more is that with something like facial recognition software and cameras that are coming from a company like Huawei, what the effectiveness of those actually is in Brazil. And one of the theories potentially for why they would be gifting surveillance tech to governments, local governments in Brazil, is to test out the software and the hardware and to see if it actually works
Yeah.
as a test case for selling it to other governments there. So I feel like with every small report I do here, a million questions come out. And again, going back to the privilege of being a journalist, where I get to talk to such interesting people in the course of reporting these stories, they often bring up like, oh, well, you should look into this and this and this. So each one opens sends me down the rabbit hole.
You're like one thing at a time, please.
Yeah, exactly.
It was part of your hunch there, maybe that I don't know if it's at best or at worst, but that Huawei's basically just collecting the data and maybe barely even using it for facial recognition at this point. Like, I could see a situation where historically Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, the training models for facial recognition that come out of countries like these are historically uh, overly skewed towards white people. Um, in the same vein, you could have a training model that comes out of Huawei in China that is overwhelmingly, Chinese people, maybe some Koreans and Japanese people mixed in for whether they're visiting or what have you, um, Vietnamese, Thai, etc. And so you have predominantly, what you might consider stereotypically Asian looking people donating, essentially gifting this tech to governments in Brazil could be collecting a whole separate set of data. You have people from historically all over the world living in Brazil, whether they're native Portuguese, Italian, Germans, Dutch, and then of course, blacks and brown people as well. Many people of color, and so you're actually getting a much wider swath of data. Do you think that's part of it, or is it more of the this is a proof of concept, and once we prove this works, then we're going to be able to sell it to countries or to governments all over the place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were a few theories for why this may be happening. And I spoke with a Brazilian researcher who contributed to the Access Now report, who brought up exactly what you said, that a lot of people on the ground there believe that one of the reasons that they're trying to spread this software and hardware there, often for free, is to be able to get that training data to send back to China. However, and again, going back to this question of challenges as a journalist, it's often very difficult to actually get government contracts and the information that would prove that. So what he told me is, I suspect this is happening. We've seen that it's happened. There's a case of it happening with a Chinese company in Zimbabwe, I believe, where they were sending back training data for AI. But in this case, the Brazilian researcher spoke to one of the heads of security in Rio de Janeiro to ask whether he thought where the data was actually going, and the guy said, I can't tell you definitively, and it's possible they don't even know
So it's going
where the
back to
data is being
China.
hosted. So yeah, yeah.
Like for
I
me,
think that
that's where I end up. I'm like, oh, if you don't know, or if you can't say definitively, and you're the person who should be able to answer this question, it's probably going home, right? Phoning home, as many devices do when you're getting software updates and that sort of thing. It's at least a portion of it. I can't imagine a scenario where it wouldn't be, not because, well, I'm a bit of a China hawk in general, but um, only because Huawei has every reason to do that. Obviously, they want the data to get better, or they want the tech to get better, and there's no better way to get this data than installing it and collecting it with a government's okay. And honestly, I'd be surprised if that would even be in the contract. So even if you got your hands on the contract itself, personally, I doubt that that sort of nitty gritty detail would be contained. It'd be something really innocuous, like some of the data collected will be sent back to Huawei HQ for analysis or your quality assurance or something like that. It'd be far more innocuous than we're collecting all the facial data and sending it back, and we're going to use it to improve our products. It might be more spelled out like that, but I'd be surprised if it was. It's probably buried in some terms of service that is very similar to what you see when you sign up for Facebook or any other platform that has any sort of facial recognition happening whatsoever.
yeah, absolutely.
Oh boy, they just don't quit. Um, what's on the horizon for rest of world? It's been a year for you. I think you said it's been a year for rest of world, so that's an important milestone to hit. What do you think we can see from the remainder of 2021 and into 2022?
Yeah, I think one really exciting initiative that we're working on is really to try and beef up our reporting team and to have people based all around the world. So, hiring regional editors in South Asia, in Africa, we have Latin America editor, Southeast Asia, as well as reporters in all those regions, so that we can really have this international team. It's something that we've been building up since the start, and I think over the past few months have made some really amazing hires, and that's going to continue happening. Something else that we're always thinking about, which I referenced before, is how to reach readers and who our readers actually are. And again, with this theme of the changing nature of journalism, I think it's really important as a reporter to try and find readers where they are, and that might not be necessarily visiting your webpage to read your articles. So trying to think of different avenues that we can share articles, whether it's something like Telegram or WhatsApp,
Hmm.
or even TikTok. I don't foresee starting a TikTok channel anytime soon. Unfortunately, we don't have too many Gen Z people on our staff, but I do think the nature of news is changing. And again, it's an exciting time to be a journalist and try and figure out how to change the way we're telling stories. Something that is cool with the rest of the world that I want to highlight is that we do have a goal of accessibility, which means that we have an incredible product and design team, and our web page is accessible to people with 2G and 3G connections. And I know that's something that our product team is working on a lot. So again, I think these twin goals of impact and also trying to reach a broader swath of readers and increase that accessibility that we have with them.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking at it now. Super high contrast, which for me, somebody with partial color blindness, like red green color blindness, is fantastic. No mixing up what's going on here, and yeah, it looks really lightweight. It doesn't look like there's a ton of. Well, first of all, I don't see any Facebook plugins or Twitter plugins or anything like that. Maybe they're hiding in the background, but I don't see any of that. Certainly not on the front page, and things are loading really fast. So yeah, this looks really good. We should tell people it's restofworld.org is how you access the website
Yes.
to read this news. Cool. So the past 18 months is has been just crap for most people. Um, what do you think is so far at least the biggest news of 2021 besides the pandemic?
And that's a big question. I mean, I do think, uh, again, from an unbiased perspective, as a tech reporter, the way that tech has penetrated every aspect of our life, especially over the 18 months, is at least what I'm looking at. And I think you can say objectively has taken over pretty much every news story you could look at. So uh, education is a big one. The move of education online, and then highlighting issues of digital divide, especially in rest of world countries. So that brings up questions of accessibility and what governments are supposed to do to be able to actually offer and make internet accessible to people. And of course, that also brings up questions of surveillance and privacy. So, in dealing with COVID, what is it going to mean for governments to be able to actually effectively track and mitigate the spread of COVID, combined with or balanced against the privacy rights of citizens in countries? And of course, we've seen a lot of pushback about that. We've seen a lot of bungling by governments of how to handle privacy concerns of citizens. And I think there's been some really incredible reporting over the past year, not just of surveillance and privacy concerns during COVID, but also how it's spread just over the past few years in general, like the big Pegasus project that came out a few weeks ago. Um, and of course, that also spreads to social networks, the manipulation of politics through technology, which you referenced before. And I think, as you said, it's changing so rapidly. Obviously, from 2012 to now, it's changed a lot, but I also think it's changed a ton in the past couple years. You see someone like Sophie Zhang, who is the Facebook whistleblower, who showed how fake engagement campaigns are spreading on Facebook. This is something that's really risen over the past couple years, and it's new techniques that are happening constantly. Um, whenever the social networks create some half-hearted policy to try and mitigate the spread of those, you see the actors who are spreading disinformation being much more ingenious in the ways that they can spread it. So that's something that, as a journalist, I'm constantly trying to keep attuned of and follow how that's changing.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, not I think it was the 2016 or yeah, 2016 US federal election campaign. The big thing was dark posts and dark posts on Facebook, and which I think is basically just an ad that you can't see anywhere else, right? It's not a post on your Facebook page that you boost. It's just, or something similar to just running an ad that only a very small target of people, or targeted audience can actually see and engage with, and using that to spread, what, to raise money, but also to spread all sorts of misinformation about your competitor in whatever race, and it being really hard to even find out that that's happening, and of course to fight it, because if you don't see it, you don't know what's being said about you, as that
Yeah.
as the person who was the subject of the dark post. I remember that, and Facebook's done some things at least to try and mitigate that, like the Facebook ad library and stuff like that, where so you can literally just go look up a Facebook page and see what ads are they running or have they run recently. It doesn't go back forever because I was looking for something that I know a Facebook page. I used to manage an ad that they were running a few years ago, but so it's not it does not super historical, but the tools do exist there to actually go find out like what ads are rest of world running on Facebook right now. And you can choose by country or you can choose anywhere. So that was a nice transparency feature. I do want to go back and say about TikTok. A, talk about a surveillance platform. B, I think it'd be actually kind of funny for you to be doing a little interpretive dance about about a story with the text popping up. I just
Yeah.
pictured that as soon as you mentioned TikTok. I'm like, oh my god, I could just imagine somebody on the team just doing, with some song and or a voiceover or something and doing this little dance with important points about the story coming up on the screen.
Oh man. I'm a little worried that my editor is going to see this and now volunteer me to start the Rest of World TikTok channel, which I mostly brought up as a joke, but I do think on a somewhat serious note, it is a way that a lot like the way that younger people, especially people in Gen Z, are going to access the news is completely different than what we're probably used to. And although it might seem funny, and certainly the idea of doing an interpretive dance to the news is, not why I signed up to be a journalist. I do think it's important to spread information accurately the best ways that we can.
I don't think you or I should be the poster person for any sort of video like that. Um, you want somebody who's going to catch the viewer's eye, and I certainly wouldn't want to be that person. Um, we're talking about Facebook a little bit here, especially in Latin America where you focus a lot of your reporting. Do you think tech companies like Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Google, they already have a lot of power here, certainly in North America and in Europe. Do they have a similar amount of power in Latin America? And as a result, do you think they have too much power in that area?
I think you really have to break it down by platform and also by region. So looking at Facebook, I think is a fascinating example, especially given excuse me. Um, the revelations, like I mentioned before, of Sophie Zhang, the whistleblower. So one of the major countries that she was talking about was Honduras, where there was a lot of fake false engagement happening, where politicians were essentially able to set up pages that purported to be people, but were spreading disinformation or were spreading certain narratives. Although it didn't seem like it was political advertising, it was essentially operating as political advertising. Uh, and through some investigation, I've seen that this is happening in a number of other countries across Latin America as well. And the big problem with a platform like Facebook, I think, is that they're largely indifferent to these countries. They don't act there. When Sophie Zhang brought up her concerns to her managers, it would take them months to operate. And a lot of the time, even if these same strategies aren't being used, like I said before, the disinformation actors are coming up with new strategies whenever Facebook changes their policies. And Facebook's not necessarily devoting the resources to being able to accurately track what's happening. And that's left to groups like Atlantic Council's DFR Lab or homegrown citizen right groups like Citizen Lab, which is a local group in Honduras that does research around this. Um, and like we were talking about before, Facebook does offer some transparency tools like the ad library, but for the most part, they're not offering nearly enough. And we've even seen recently that they're cracking down on a lot of researchers who are looking at disinformation on the platform. So it's really difficult when you have these platforms that both have often a monopoly on something like political advertising or e-commerce or what have you, but are also in a lot of cases indifferent or slowly acting or not aware of the local intricacies of what's happening on the ground there. The ad library, I think, is a really interesting case, something that I saw in Honduras. And I did a piece a couple months ago about a report that was released by this group, the Honduras Citizen Lab, about disinformation and political, fake engagement that was happening in the run up to the primaries in March for the presidential elections. And what politicians across the board were doing was still posting political ads in Honduras during a blackout period that is nationally mandated, where you're not allowed to have political ads during that period. And Facebook, of course, isn't going to have someone who's very well versed in the political intricacies of the law in Honduras. So the politicians were able to get away with that. And while the platform did eventually take them down, it took forever. So again, I think the biggest issue with these platforms is that indifference and not really devoting the resources necessary to be able to handle the local conditions in every country they operate in.
Yeah, I know they've done a lot in the UK and Canada and the US, probably Australia and New Zealand as well, and probably other non-English speaking countries like France, Germany, uh, Spain, but probably most of Europe where they do have a lot of users. They have high visibility. The EU loves to investigate Facebook for just about any violation of any rule or any law that they come across. But yeah, it's they I would love to see Facebook apply the same standards to engaging in El Salvador, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, Chile, anywhere else south of me and you, where there are rules and obviously they need to be followed, but there's not nearly that level of care and engagement in I'm probably out of what 190 something countries, probably out of 100 of them, where maybe even less or maybe even more, where only 40, 50, 90 tops are getting that level of care and attention around elections and that sort of thing, but not other places. It looks like Sophie wrote something just in June that touches on a lot of this called "I saw millions compromise their Facebook accounts to fuel fake engagement." Is that part of that long-standing story? It looks like she goes into it in quite a bit of depth.
Yes, we're really lucky that Sophie wrote an op-ed or an ideas piece in our ideas section
Yeah.
that's helmed by the great Debbie Lockwood. I would encourage people to pitch her stories if they have any subjects on global technology they want to write for rest of world. Uh, and she was talking about an underreported aspect in her revelations, which was people who will willingly give up their accounts, I believe, to be used in fake engagement campaigns.
Yeah.
Something I was looking at more was bots that are created uh, often to spread certain hashtags used by all politicians. It's not like just one side of it. And these countries are doing this, but you have bots that are often copying both the name and images of real people, and then are created a week before the election and are spreading hashtags. And the funny thing about this is it's so easy once they're identified to find them, because you can just do a reverse image search and find the photo somewhere else on the web. And something that Sophie brought up, because I interviewed her for this piece that I did, is that Facebook, of course, has the resources to be able to find this type of activity, and in a lot of cases, they're the only group that actually has the information to be able to find this type of activity, and they're still not doing anything about it, which is the most concerning part of the story.
Yeah. Well, and then you end up getting people quitting, like the CISO, Alex Stamos, I think his name was, like just up and quitting. Like, forget it. I'm not, I don't want my name associated with not cracking down on this type of behavior, not taking security vulnerabilities seriously. You have good people working at Facebook who, like Sophie, like Alex, who just get tossed by the wayside regardless of their position. Like, how do you not listen to the chief information security officer who wants to dedicate resources to solve problems like this and is not allowed to, essentially. So yeah, it's a real
Yeah,
shame. um
the I think the craziest thing that Sophie told me when I talked to her is that when she found a lot of this activity, it wasn't part of her main job. She was basically doing it in after hours in her own free time, and it would take her a couple hours to find it happening. It's not heavy lift. They can do it pretty easily with the resources that they have, and like you said, sometimes they do, but it needs to be done on a much wider scale.
yeah, yeah, it's thanks for dealing with the G20 or or maybe a little bit more, but like what about everybody else? That's really where the majority of the abuse is happening now. um you touched or we touched earlier on companies like Huawei giving out free tech to countries like Brazil. What about Google automatically installing a COVID-19 tracker on phones in Costa Rica? What's happening there, and I imagine you have thoughts on it, but let's start with what's happening there, and then we can move on to your thoughts.
Yes, that was a fun story I did about a month ago. It was in June. Costa Ricans woke up one morning, Android users, and found an app that had been installed on their phone by the Ministry of Health. And it was a COVID tracking app. And of course, many of them were concerned. I had a little fun with this story and tracking some of the Twitter reactions of people, especially, I would say, less traditional people on Twitter who had more outlandish views on security and the role of the government and what their reaction was to this happening. Uh, Upon looking a little more into the story, it became clear that this wasn't actually an app that was downloaded on people's phones. It was a bug that was part of this new program that both Google and Apple have rolled out, which means that for governments who are trying to do COVID tracing, you don't actually need to download a separate app. It'll actually be activated as part of the operating system in the background, although, of course, the idea is for it to be opt-in. And through a bug, when Costa Rica, who is, I believe, the first country to roll this out, did it, it showed up that it had been automatically downloaded for Android users without them being able to opt in. When I spoke to someone at the Ministry of Tech in Costa Rica, he assured me that this wasn't, in fact, what was happening. It wasn't any sort of app that was being installed in people's phones without their consent. It was just a bug that showed the icon there.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, for Apple users, they did get to toggle in when the feature was actually launched. Uh, I have spoken to some people who are skeptical that's the case and believe that uh, probably the governments and especially ones that have a friendly relationship with the telecoms there probably do have a lot more surveillance capabilities than they're letting on. But I think this is a perfect example of what we were talking about before, which is this balance between civilians' right for privacy, governments needing to actually proactively be able to track something like COVID, and then of course governments bungling everything and and just messing up the rollout so completely that it erodes people's trust. In this case, I think arguably you could say that for countries like Costa Rica, it'll be better for people to not have to download a separate app and to be able to have this running in their operating system, which is more low lift if they want to opt into it. But you have to win over the citizens in order to roll out those types of programs. You have to earn their trust, and time again, you're seeing them mess up what should be pretty simple rollouts in cases like this, and it's not great.
Yeah, yeah. Anytime, pardon me, anytime a government, local, provincial, state, federal, messes something up, yeah, especially something as significant and important as that, yeah, it just erodes the trust and makes people even more skeptical the next time when everything might go perfectly and you've got buying at the cabinet and you've been talking about it for weeks if not months on TV and then in the news, and then you finally roll it out and you get tinfoil hat type people, or you get anti-vaxxers, or you get uh, uh, people who rightfully want to protect their civil rights, civil liberties, just going after it and just trying to poke holes wherever they can because they don't trust you. Um, yeah, it was. I'm I remember hearing about the operating system level feature with the COVID encounter notification system, um, and I had the app for a while. I did my civil duty. I downloaded the app from Health Canada. I'm pretty sure it was a nationwide app that was available in Ontario and a few other provinces, but unfortunately, the uptake just wasn't nearly high enough for it to matter. And so eventually, I actually uninstalled it just after I went to France last month. But they have a whole other separate app that works way better and has far more capabilities, and is the data is all stored only on device, called two anti-COVID. So kill, no wait, all anti-COVID, not tway is kill. Um, uh, all anti-COVID, which basically meant it was like an anti-COVID super app. Like everything you needed to do, you needed to find where to get a test, you needed to store, like take a screenshot or scan the QR code for your test and store the data so that you could get into a nightclub or get into the post office or wherever you wanted to go, and you needed to show that you either were vaccinated or you had a recent antigen or PCR test. That was all in the app. And so as much as it was a slight bit of a pain to go download an app I didn't even know I needed, and go through that initial setup, even when I got back to Canada, they accepted the scan. Like all the data was there, and there was a mode for showing somebody the actual raw data, which there really wasn't much, or for letting somebody scan the QR code with the venue operator version of the app, which from what I could tell, again, doesn't give them much data. It's just like yeah, you can let this person in type result. So yeah, I got the complete flip side where there's almost no technology infrastructure here for a vaccine passport or just keeping your data on hand so that if we get to a place where Ontario or Canada really has a vaccine passport in place, as much as I may not like it, um, I've already seen almost the complete flip side, and I think there's a way to do it well that doesn't infringe hugely on civil liberties, and or at least that the data is all there on your device and is not going anywhere else, so that it's really up to you of to choose whether you want to expose it at various times or not. Again, it's not where we were 2 years ago, in terms of civil rights and civil liberties, but it's certainly better than having living under some sort of authoritarian state or draconian system where it's going to be viewed all the time, and the government's literally in your pocket, pulling data from your device, or something like that.
Yeah,
Couple
absolutely.
couple more questions here, and then I think we got to wrap up. You mentioned Pegasus recently. Can we go back and explain that a little bit? What the Pegasus spyware issue was, and how it was being used to track people like you, journalists, activists, and other government officials.
Yeah, so Pegasus is a spyware that's developed by the Israeli NSO group, which is a company that develops spyware. And this is a story that's been out there for the past few years, that governments across the world, from Saudi Arabia to Mexico, were purchasing contracts for Pegasus, and then were installing it on the phones of everyone from journalists to human rights activists to lawyers to opposition politicians. I've looked at this most closely in Mexico. I've been following this story for the past few years, and there it happened under the Peña Nieto government. He was the president before the current president, who's Lopez Obrador, and ostensibly the use of Pegasus was supposed to be against organized crime, but it actually came out that, again, it was targeting politicians, a lot of opposition journalists, and activists across the country. What we learned a few weeks ago from the Pegasus project, which was done by a consortium of outlets and NGOs across the world, from a data leak, was that they found 50,000 people that were likely targeted by Pegasus across the world, and 15,000 of those were in Mexico. And just a small briefer on how the technology works is, if you have a smartphone, you'll essentially receive some sort of phishing message, usually highly targeted to you. So it can be something like a text that says, your husband is in the hospital. Click on this link to check his status. Once you click on the link, it'll install the spyware in the background, and then the government will be able to track everything that's happening on your phone. And something that was revealed in the Pegasus project a few weeks ago is that, at least in Mexico, there's evidence that some of the journalists who have been murdered in the past few years had Pegasus on their phone, and potentially even were having their location tracked, which led to their murder. Of course, this is something that hasn't been directly proven, but the combination of these different factors is highly suspect. And I wrote a piece in an op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks ago about why it had been so prolific in Mexico, and why, even though Lopez Obrador, the current president, ostensibly has not been using Pegasus, there still hasn't been nearly enough done to reveal transparently how it was used. And Pegasus aside, there's so many other surveillance technologies that are being used around the world. I think Pegasus is even somewhat of a red herring. It's just the tip of the iceberg. And we have to look at all these other technologies, such as Celebrate, which can be used to hack into people's phones. Where if we just focus on one shiny object, we can lose track of how widespread this has become over the past few years.
Yeah, I've spoken with somebody about Celebrite a little while ago. Oh, it was Rebecca Wexler, lawyer, somewhere out west, UC Berkeley, I think. And so we that had just come out when she and I sat down. So we dug right into that and what the folks at Signal had discovered when this mysterious package fell off the back of a truck. Um, I have to say, taking the political angle on this, I would like to think, well, sorry, before I say this, are Lopez Obrador and Piñeto, are they different, part of different parties in Mexico?
Yes, very, very separate sides of the spectrum. So Lopez Obrador came on as this more insurgent candidate trying to reform things, and unfortunately, that hasn't necessarily been the case, which I think is indicative of what's been happening with Pegasus.
Okay, so then I would say, taking the really political version of this and cynical look, I would like to think Lopez Obrador and his cabinet or what have you, his staff would blow this wide open if it was the past government and a different political party who was putting it to use, and put that party basically in the backwaters, political backwaters for years, and multiple elections, because that to me that's really damning. Like, if you actually use it on organized crime, okay, fine, right? People who here in Canada and the US, you would have a logical reason to target, or whatever the actual language is, in those sorts of situations. But obviously, applying it to people you basically just don't like, um, for whatever reason, is, as far as I'm concerned, incredibly shameful, and obviously really damaging. I was going to ask whether anything had actually come out of all the spyware being installed. Obviously, you've already mentioned that there's a huge correlation between at least some of the journalists who were killed in Mexico over during that time frame, probably or definitely having Pegasus installed on their phones, which is just sad, that would happen. Did anything else come out of that? Were there maybe scandals revealed about opposition politicians, or any actual corruption of any kind, that came out of that? Maybe something good, just out of curiosity. Not that it justifies the means, but I'm just curious if anything actually positive came out of that, or whether it was really just the Mexican government at the time just going after people they just didn't want to see around anymore.
Yeah, unfortunately, not that I've seen. Mentioning Lopez Obrador and how he should be using this as an opening to show how different his administration is than the previous one. Something wild that came out of this is that, in fact, most of his inner circle was likely targeted by Pegasus, including his family members and doctor, even though he was not. And he's of course denounced that, but still has not said that they're going to formally launch an investigation or share more transparently with the public additional information on how it was being used. In terms of productive information coming out of Pegasus, again, I don't think I've seen anything along those lines. I do think this can be a slight failing in journalism, that we don't necessarily always look for the positive in stories. So I don't know a journalist who
That's
would
fine.
take the angle like, actually Pegasus was great in these cases. But I'm sure if that had been the case, the Peña Nieto government would have been very vocal about the ways in which it did work, and I haven't seen any stories along those lines.
Yeah, you're probably right about that last part there. Um, okay, well, given everything you know about the country you're hoping to move to, and all the reporting you've already done, and some of your co-reporters who potentially have passed away in fairly recent history for a variety of reasons. How do you protect your privacy online as a journalist? And you don't need to give specific details or like I take this and I put it over here and blah blah blah, but just like tools and maybe techniques that you use in order to cut.
Yeah, well, I can give some broader recommendations that we actually posted in this story that I did on how law enforcement officials across Latin America are breaking into activists' phones. And we were able to compile an infographic in collaboration with Access Now, the digital rights group. And they gave some really good recommendations that people can do.
Perfect.
Some of them are as simple as being able to set complex passcodes to be able to get into your phone in the case that police force you to use your fingerprint, or which is much more easy to use Face ID if you have that set up. Of course, to have passcodes enabled for all of your apps to make it much more difficult to access them, to have disappearing messages, to make sure that the people that you're in communication with are also taking those precautions. In the case of your data being seized, or if your phone is confiscated, you don't want to put any of the people that you've been talking with at risk also. And then, of course, I think there's lots of other simple things you can do. Obviously, separating work computers from personal computers, using VPNs, being safe with which networks you use, anything along those lines are all great digital security techniques. But especially in Latin America, where I do think there are fewer digital rights, especially with how law enforcement treats confiscation of hardware, it is really important to take safeguards in making sure that your phone is encrypted and that it's as difficult as possible for them to access your information if they do have physical or remote access to your devices.
So I'm turning off Face ID if I go to Mexico. Good to know. It's just so handy.
I honestly think anywhere you probably should not be using Face ID. I think in the U.S. the case law is still pretty divided on this, whether it's falls under self-incrimination for police to be able to ask you to turn over your fingerprint or your passcode or Face ID, and certainly with fingerprint or Face ID, it's easier. I don't know how it operates in Canada, but I think anywhere in the phone it's better. I mean, anywhere in the world it's better safe than sorry.
Yeah, there's still something to be said for here as well. Something that's in your head versus something that is physical about you. That distinction of not being able to ask you for a password, it does exist to at least a certain extent here. So yeah, definitely something to consider. It's really handy. It's the pandemic has revealed just how frustrating it can be, but then Apple made it easier to unlock your iPhone with your Apple Watch, assuming it's on you and
Yeah.
also unlocked. And it detects that you're wearing a mask, which is also not flawless. So I might just have to turn it off and revert back to
Yeah,
passcodes
it's tough. All these things
everywhere.
that make our life so much easier also make us much less secure. One
Yes.
other thing I would add is password managers are probably the best possible tool that you can use
Yeah,
for
I
people who do not have one.
yeah, I know the password for my laptop and my phone and my banking because I could be on a variety of devices and even just for my laptop. Like I don't want to have to load up the password manager to get into it when I'm on my laptop. But otherwise, I don't know what my email address or what my email passwords are. I don't know what my cryptocurrency exchange passwords are. I legitimately have no idea what they are, even for my Apple ID. So that's and obviously I know what the password is for the for the password manager. But without that, you know, there's going to be all sorts of things that somebody who's trying to get my data is not going to be able to get access to, um, unless they scan my face right now with my iPhone. But I've got all sorts of
Yeah,
other apps that do have, like you mentioned earlier, their own individual passcode enabled, or you need Face ID again and again and again, and long term, that's not, especially if they beat me up, that's not going to work forever. But yeah, cool. Leo, thanks so much for your time today. It was really, really interesting to hear everything you had to say. Thanks for sharing more about Rest of World, about Sophie Zhang's work there, and the whistleblower approach she had to take with Facebook. And hopefully things work out for you for the rest of the year. And thanks to everyone for listening.
yeah. Thank you so much, Derek. It's really been a pleasure, and
Perfect.
I love the podcast. So looking forward to future episodes.
Thanks. Thanks for everyone to once again for listening. And until next time, stay free.